Suetoniuses, the 12 Caesars. 1. Julius Caesar, afterwards deified. Gaius Julius Caesar lost his father at the age of 15. Footnote: 85 to 84 BC, end of footnote. During the next consulship, after being nominated to the priesthood of Jupiter, he broke an engagement made for him while he was still a boy to marry one Casutia, for though rich, she came of only equestrian family. Instead, he married Cornelia, daughter of that Cinna, who had been consul 4 times, and later she bore him a daughter named Julia. The dictator Sulla tried to make Caesar divorce Cornelia, and when he refused, stripped him of the priesthood, his wife's dowry, and his own inheritance, treating him as if he were a member of the opposite party. Caesar disappeared from public view, and though suffering from a virulent attack of quartan fever, was forced to find a new hiding place almost every night and bribe householders to protect him from Sulla's secret police. Finally, he won Sulla's pardon through the intercession of the Vestal Virgins and his near relatives, Mamercus, Aemilius, and Aurelius Cotta. It is well known that when his most devoted and eminent friends pleaded Caesar's cause and would not let the matter drop, Sulla at last gave way. Whether he was divinely inspired or showed peculiar foresight is an arguable point, but these were his words. "Very well, then. You win. Take him. But never forget that the man whom you want me to spare will one day prove the ruin of the party which you and I have so long defended. There are many Mariuses in this fellow Caesar." Footnote: Gaius Marcius, 157 to 186 BC. The famous enemy of Sulla was consul 7 times. End of footnote. Caesar saw military service in Asia, where he went as aide-de-camp to Marcus Thermus, the provincial governor. Footnote: 81 BC, end of footnote. When Thermus sent Caesar to raise a fleet in Bithynia, he wasted so much time at King Nicomedes' court that a homosexual relationship between them was suspected, and suspicion gave place to scandal, when soon after his return to headquarters he revisited Bithynia, ostensibly collecting a debt incurred there by one of his freedmen. However, Caesar's reputation improved later in the campaign, when Thermus awarded him the civic crown of oak leaves at the storming of Metellina, for saving a fellow soldier's life. He also campaigned in Cilicia under Servilius Esoricus, but not for long, because the news of Sulla's death sent him hurrying back to Rome, where a revolt headed by Marcus Lepidus seemed to offer prospects of rapid advancement. Footnote: 78 BC. End of footnote. Nevertheless, though Lepidus made him very advantageous offers, Caesar turned them down. He had small confidence in Lepidus's capacities and found the political atmosphere less promising than he had been led to believe. After this revolt was suppressed, Caesar brought a charge of extortion against Cornelius Dolabella, an ex-consul who had once been awarded a triumph, but failed to secure a sentence, so he decided to visit Rhodes until the resultant ill-feeling had time to die down, meanwhile taking a course in rhetoric from Apollonius Molo, the best living exponent of the art. Winter had already set in when he sailed for Rhodes and was captured by pirates off the island of Parmascusa. They kept him prisoner for nearly 40 days, to his intense annoyance. He had with him only a physician and 2 valets, having sent the rest of his staff away to borrow the ransom money. As soon as the stipulated 50 talents arrived, which make 12,000 gold pieces, and the pirates duly set him ashore, he raised a fleet and went after them. He had often smilingly sworn, while still in their power, that he would soon capture and crucify them, and this is exactly what he did. Then he continued to Rhodes, but Mithridates was now ravaging the nearby coast of Asia Minor, so to avoid the charge of showing inertia while the allies of Rome were in danger, he raised a force of irregulars and drove Mithridates' deputy from the province, which confirmed the timorous and half-hearted cities of Asia in their allegiance. On Caesar's return to Rome, the assembly voted him the rank of colonel, and he vigorously helped their leaders to undo Sulla's legislation by restoring the tribunes of the people to their ancient powers. Then one Plautius introduced a bill for the recall from exile of Caesar's brother-in-law, Lucius Cinna, who, with other fellow conspirators, had escaped to Spain after Lepidus's death and joined Suetonius. Caesar himself spoke in support of the bill, which was passed. During his quaestorship, that would be a footnote there, stipulating 69 BC. During his quaestorship, he made the customary funeral speeches from the rostra in honor of his aunt Julia and his wife Cornelia, and while eulogizing Julia's maternal and paternal ancestry, did the same for the Caesars too. Her mother, he said, was a descendant of kings, namely the Marci Regus, a family founded by the Roman king Ancus Marcius, and her father of gods, since the Julians, of which we Caesars are a branch, reckon descent from the goddess Venus. Thus Julius' stock can claim both the sanctity of kings, who reign supreme among mortals, and the reverence due to gods, who hold even kings in their power. He next married Pompeia, Quintus Pompeius' daughter, who was also Sulla's granddaughter, but divorced her on a suspicion of adultery with Publius Claudius. Indeed, so persistent was the rumor of Claudius having disguised himself as a woman and seduced her at the feast of the good goddess, from which all men are excluded, that the Senate ordered a judicial inquiry into the alleged desecration of these sacred rites. As quaestor, Caesar was appointed to further Spain, where the governor sent him off on an assize circuit. At Gades he saw a statue of Alexander the Great in the temple of Heracles. Hercules, and was overheard to sigh impatiently, vexed, it seems, that an age when Alexander had already conquered the whole world, he himself had done nothing in the least epoch-making. Moreover, when on the following night, much to his dismay, he had a dream of raping his own mother, the soothsayers greatly encouraged him by their interpretation of it, namely, that he was destined to conquer the earth, our universal mother. At all events, he laid down his quaestorship at once, bent on performing some notable act at the first opportunity that offered. He visited the Latin colonists beyond the Po, who were bitterly demanding the same Roman citizenship as that granted to other townsfolk in Italy, and might have persuaded them to revolt, had not the consuls realized the danger and garrisoned that district with the legions recently raised for the Cilician campaign. Undiscouraged, Caesar soon made an even more daring attempt at revolution in Rome itself, a few days before taking up his aedileship. Footnote 65 BC. End of footnote. He was suspected of plotting with Marcus Crassus, an ex-consul, also with Publius Sulla and Lucius Suetonius, who had jointly been elected to the consulship but found guilty of bribery and corruption. These four had agreed to wait until the new year and then attack the Senate House, killing as many senators as convenient. Crassus would then proclaim himself dictator and Caesar his master of horse. The government would be reorganized to suit their pleasure. Sulla and Suetonius would be appointed consuls. Tenucius Geminus mentions their plot in his history. More information is given in Marcus Biblius' edicts and in the orations of Gaius Curio the Elder. Another reference to it may be detected in Cicero's letter to Axius, where Caesar is said to have established in his consulship the monarchy which he had planned while only an aedile. Tenucius adds that Crassus was prevented either by scruples or by nervousness from appearing at the appointed hour, and Caesar therefore did not give the agreed signal, which according to Curio was letting his gown fall and expose the shoulder. Both Curio and Marcus Actorius Naso state that Caesar also plotted with Annius Piso, a young nobleman suspected of raising a conspiracy in the city and for that reason appointed governor of Spain, although he had neither solicited nor qualified for that position. Caesar apparently was to lead a revolt in Rome as soon as Piso did so in Spain, the Ambrani. Footnote. A people of Liguria. End of footnote. The Ambrani and the people who lived beyond the Po would have risen simultaneously, but Piso's death cancelled the plan. During his aedileship, Caesar filled the Comitium, the Forum, its adjacent basilicas, and the Capitol itself with a display of the material which he meant to use in his public shows, building temporary colonnades for the purpose. He exhibited wild beast hunts and stage plays, some at his own expense, some in cooperation with his colleague Marcus Bibulus, but took all the credit in either case, so that Bibulus remarked openly, "The temple of the heavenly twins in the Forum is always simply called Castors, and I always play Pollux to Caesar's Castor when we give a public entertainment together." Caesar also put on a gladiatorial show, but had collected so immense a troop of combatants that his terrified political opponents rushed a bill through the House, limiting the number of gladiators that anyone might keep in Rome. Consequently, far fewer pairs fought than had been advertised. After thus securing the goodwill of the public and their tribunes, Caesar tried to get himself the control of Egypt by popular vote. His excuse for demanding so unusual an appointment was an outcry against the Alexandrians, who had just deposed King Ptolemy the 12th, although the Senate had recognized him as an ally and friend of Rome. However, the aristocratic party opposed the measure, so as Attila, Caesar took vengeance by replacing the public monuments destroyed by Sulla many years ago that had commemorated Marius's victories over Jugurtha and Cimbri and the Teutons. Further, as judge of the court of inquiry into murder, he prosecuted men who had earned public bounties for bringing in the heads of Roman citizens outlawed during the proscriptions, although this rough justice had been expressly sanctioned in the Cornelian laws. He also bribed the man to bring a charge of high treason against Gaius Rabirius, who some years previously had earned the Senate's gratitude by checking the seditious activities of Lucius Suetonius, a tribune. Caesar, chosen by lot to try Rabirius, pronounced the sentence with such satisfaction that when Rabirius appealed to the people, the greatest argument in his favor was the judge's obvious prejudice. Obliged to abandon his ambition of governing Egypt, Caesar stood for the office of chief priest, and used the most flagrant bribery to secure it. The story goes that, reckoning up the enormous debts thus contracted, he told his mother, as she kissed him goodbye on the morning of the poll, that if he did not return to her as chief priest, he would not return at all. However, he defeated his two prominent rivals, both of whom were much older and more distinguished than himself, and the votes he won from their own tribes exceeded those cast for them in the entire poll. When the Catilinarian conspiracy came to light, the whole house, with the sole exception of Caesar, then praetor-elect, demanded the death penalty for Catiline and his associates. Caesar proposed merely that they should be imprisoned, each in a different town, and their estates confiscated. What was more, he so browbeat those senators who took a sterner line, by suggesting that the commons would conceive an enduring hatred for them if they persisted in this view, that Decimus Silenus, as consul-elect, felt obliged to interpret his own proposal, which, however, he could not bring himself to recast, in a more liberal sense, begging Caesar not to misread it so savagely. And Caesar would have gained his point, since many senators, including the consul Cicero's brother, had been won over to his view, and had Marcus Cato not kept the irresolute Senate in line. Caesar continued to block proceedings until a body of Roman knights, serving as a defense force to the house, threatened to kill him unless he ceased his violent opposition. They even unsheathed their swords and made such passes at him that most of his companions fled, and the remainder huddled around, protecting him with their arms or their gowns. He was sufficiently impressed not only to leave the house, but to keep away from it for the rest of the year. On the first day of his praetorship, 62 BC in the footnote, end of footnote, Caesar ordered Quintus Catulus to appear before the assembly and explain why he had made so little progress with the restoration of the Capitol, demanding that Catulus's commission should be taken from him and entrusted instead to another. Footnote: Gnaeus Pompeius, Pompey. End of footnote. However, the senators of the aristocratic party who were escorting the newly elected consuls to their inaugural sacrifice in the Capitol heard what was afoot and came pouring downhill in a body to offer obstinate resistance. Caesar withdrew his proposal. Caecilius Metellus, a tribune of the people, then defended his colleague's veto by bringing in some highly inflammatory bills, and Caesar stubbornly championed them on the floor of the House until at last both Metellus and himself were suspended by a senatorial decree. Nevertheless, he had the effrontery to continue holding his office and his court until warned that he would be removed by force. Thereupon he dismissed the lictors, took off his praetorian robe, and went quickly home, where he had decided to live in retirement because the times allowed him no other alternative. On the following day, however, the populace made a spontaneous move towards Caesar's house, riotously offering to put him back in his post, but he restrained their ardor. The Senate, who had hurriedly met to deal with this demonstration, were so surprised by his unexpectedly correct attitude that they sent a deputation of high officials to thank him publicly, then summoned him to the house, where with warm praises they revoked their decree and confirmed him in his praetorship. The next danger that threatened Caesar was the inclusion of his name in a list of Catilinarian conspirators handed to the special commissioner, Novius Niger, by an informer named Lucius Vettius, and also in another list laid before the Senate by Quintus Curius, who had been voted a public bounty as the first person to betray the plot. Curius claimed that this information came directly from Catiline, and Vettius went so far as to declare that he could produce a letter written to Catiline in Caesar's own hand. Caesar would not lie down under this insult, and appealed to Cicero's own admission that he had voluntarily come forward to warn him about the plot, and that Curius was not therefore entitled to the bounty. As for Vettius, who had been obliged to produce bond when he made his revelations, this was declared forfeit, and his goods seized. The commons, crowding around the rostra, nearly tore him in pieces. Caesar thereupon sent Vettius off to Gaol, and Novius Niger, the commissioner, as well, for having let a magistrate of superior rank to himself be indicted at his tribunal. The province of Further Spain was now allotted to Caesar. He relieved himself of the creditors who tried to keep him in Rome until he had paid his debts, by providing sureties for the eventual settlement. Then he took the illegal and unprecedented step of hurrying off before the Senate had either formally confirmed his appointment or voted him the necessary funds. He may have been afraid of being impeached while still a private citizen, or he may have been anxious to respond as quickly as possible to the appeals of our Spanish allies for help against aggression. At any rate, on his arrival in Spain, he rapidly restored order and returned to Rome in the following summer with equal haste. not waiting until he had been relieved to demand a triumph and stand for the consulship. But the day of the consular elections had already been announced. His candidacy could therefore not be admitted unless he entered the city as a civilian, and when a general outcry arose against his intrigues to be exempted from the regulations governing candidatures, he was faced with the alternative of foregoing the triumph or foregoing the consulship. There were two other candidates, Lucius Lucius and Marcus Bibulus. Caesar now approached Lucius and suggested that they should join forces, but since Lucius had more money and Caesar greater influence, it was agreed that Lucius should finance their joint candidacy by bribing the voters. The aristocratic party got wind of this arrangement, and fearing that if Caesar were elected consul with a pliant colleague by his side, he would stop at nothing to gain his own ends, they authorized Marcus Bibulus to bribe the voters as heavily as Lucius had done. Many aristocrats contributed to Bibulus's campaign funds, and Cato himself admitted that this was an occasion when even bribery might be excused as a legitimate means of preserving the Constitution. Sounds like the Democratic Party in America. Sorry. Caesar and Bibulus were elected consuls, but the aristocrats continued to restrict Caesar's influence by ensuring that when he and Bibulus had completed their term, both should govern provinces of the smallest possible importance, designated as woods and mountain pastures. Infuriated by this slight, Caesar exerted his charm on Pompey, who had quarreled with the Senate because they were so slow in approving the steps that he had taken to defeat King Mithridates of Pontus. He also succeeded in conciliating Pompey and Marcus Crassus. They were still at odds after their failure to agree on matters of policy, while sharing the consulship. Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus now framed a triple pact, jointly swearing to oppose all legislation of which any one of them might disapprove. Caesar's first act as consul was to rule that a daily record of proceedings in the Senate and in the people's court should be taken and published. He also revived the obsolete custom of having an orderly walk before him during the months in which his colleague held the rods of office, while the lictors marched behind. Next, he introduced an agrarian law, and when Bibulus delayed its passage through the Senate by announcing that the omens were unfavorable, drove him from the forum by force of arms. On the following day, Bibulus lodged a complaint in the House, and when nobody dared move a vote of censure or to make any observation on this scandalous event, though decrees condemning minor breaches of the peace had often been passed, he felt so frustrated that he stayed at home for the rest of his term, satisfying his resentment with further announcements about unfavorable omens. Caesar was thus enabled to govern alone and do very much as he pleased. It became a joke to sign and seal bogus documents, executed during the consulship of Julius and Caesar, rather than during the consulship of Bibulus and Caesar. And this lampoon went the rounds. The event occurred, as I recall, when Caesar governed Rome. Caesar, not Marcus Bibulus, who kept his seat at home. The plain called Stellus had been devoted to public purposes in earlier times, and the Campanian territory had also been set aside and farmed on behalf of the government. Caesar partitioned both these districts among fathers of 3 or more children, without casting the customary lots. When the Roman tax farmers asked for relief, he cancelled 1/3 of their obligations, but gave them frank warning not to bid too high for their contracts in future. He freely granted all other pleas whatsoever, and indeed met with no opposition or intimidated anyone who dared intervene. Marcus Cato once tried to delay proceedings by talking out the debate, but Caesar had him forcibly ejected by a lictor and led off to prison. Lucius Lucullus went a little too far in opposing Caesar's policy, whereupon Caesar so terrified him by threats of prosecution that Lucullus fell on his knees and begged Caesar's pardon. Hearing that Cicero had been making a doleful speech in court about the evils of his times, Caesar at once granted the long-standing plea of Cicero's enemy, Publius Clodius, to be transferred from patrician to plebeian rank, rushing this measure through the House at 3 o'clock, just before the adjournment. Finally, he began an attack on his aristocratic opponents as a body by bribing an informer, who appeared on the rostra and announced that some of them had tried to make him assassinate Pompey. As had been arranged, the informer mentioned a few names, but the whole affair raised such strong suspicions of double-dealing that Caesar, realizing that he had been too hasty, is said to have poisoned his agent. Caesar then married Calpurnia, daughter of Lucius Piso, his successor in the consulship, and at the same time betrothed Julia to Pompey, thus breaking her previous engagement to Servilius Caepio, who had recently given him a great deal of support in the struggle against Bibulus. He now always called on Pompey to open debates in the House, though having hitherto reserved this honor for Crassus, thereby flouting the tradition that a consul should continue throughout the year, to preserve the order of precedence established for speakers on New Year's Day. Having thus secured the goodwill of his father-in-law Piso and his son-in-law Pompey, Caesar surveyed the many provinces open to him and chose Gaul as being the likeliest to supply him with the wealth and triumphs. True, he was at first appointed governor only of Cisalpine Gaul and Illyria. The proposal came from Vatinius, but afterwards the Senate added Transalpine Gaul to his jurisdiction, fearing that if this were denied him, the commons would insist that he should have it. His elation was such that he could not refrain from boasting to a packed house some days later that, having now gained his dearest wish, to the annoyance and grief of his opponents, he would proceed to stamp upon their persons. When someone interjected with a sneer that a woman would not find this an easy feat, he answered amicably, "Why not? Semiramis was supreme in Syria, and the Amazons once ruled over a large part of Asia." At the close of his consulship, the praetors Gaius Memmius and Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus demanded an inquiry into his official conduct during the past year. Caesar referred the matter to the Senate, who would not discuss it, so after 3 days had been wasted in idle recriminations, he left for Gaul. His quaestor was at once charged with various irregularities, as a first step towards his own impeachment. Then Lucius Antistius, a tribune of the people, arraigned Caesar, who, however, appealed to the whole college of tribunes, pleading absence on business of national importance, and thus staved off the trial. To prevent a reoccurrence of this sort of trouble, he made a point of putting the chief magistrates of each new year under some obligation to him, and refusing to support any candidates or allow them to be elected unless they promised to defend his cause while he was absent from Rome. He had no hesitation in holding some of them to their promises by an oath or even a written contract. At last, Lucius, Domitius, Ahenobarbus stood for the consulship and openly threatened that, once elected, he would remove Caesar from his military command, having failed to do this while praetor. So Caesar called upon Pompey and Crassus to visit Lucca, which lay in his province, and there persuaded them to prolong his governorship of Gaul for another 5 years, and to oppose Domitius's candidature. This success encouraged Caesar to expand his regular army with legions raised at his own expense, one even recruited in Transalpine Gaul and called a lauda, Gallic for the crested lark, which he trained and equipped in Roman style. Later he made every lauda legionary a full citizen. He now lost no opportunity of picking quarrels, however unfair and dangerous, with allies as well as hostile and barbarous tribes, and marching against them. At first the Senate set up a commission of inquiry into the state of the Gallic provinces, and some speakers went so far as to recommend that Caesar should be handed over to the enemy. But the more successful his campaigns, the more frequent the public thanksgivings voted, and the holidays that went with them were longer than any general before him had ever earned. Briefly, his 9 years' governorship produced the following results. He reduced to the form of a province the whole of Gaul, enclosed by the Pyrenees, the Alps, the Cevennes, the Rhine, and the Rhone, about 640,000 square miles, except for certain allied states which had given him useful support, and exacted an annual tribute of 400,000 gold pieces. Caesar was the first Roman to build a military bridge across the Rhine and caused the Germans on the farther bank heavy losses. He also invaded Britain, a hitherto unknown country, and defeated the natives, from whom he exchanged a large sum of money as well as hostages for future good behavior. He met with only 3 serious reverses: in Britain, when his fleet was all but destroyed by a gale; in Gaul, when one of his legions was routed; at Gergovia among the Auvergne Mountains. That would be Auvergne Mountains. And on the German frontier, when his generals, Titurius and Aurunculeius, were ambushed and killed. During these 9 years, Caesar lost, one after the other, his mother, his daughter, and his grandson. Meanwhile, the assassination of Publius Clodius had caused such an outcry that the Senate voted for the appointment of only a single consul, naming Pompey as their choice. When the tribunes of the people wanted Caesar to stand as Pompey's colleague, Caesar asked whether they would not persuade the commons to let him do so without visiting Rome. His governorship of Gaul, he wrote, was nearly at an end, and he preferred not to leave until his conquest had been completed. Their granted of this concession so fired Caesar's ambitions that he neglected no expense in winning popularity, both as a private citizen and as a candidate for his second consulship. He began building a new forum with the spoils taken in Gaul, and paid more than 1,000,000 gold pieces for the site alone. Then he announced a gladiatorial show and a public banquet in memory of his daughter Julia, an unprecedented event, and to create as much excitement among the commons as possible, had the banquet catered for party by his own household, partly by the market contractors. He also issued an order that any well-known gladiator who failed to win the approval of the circus should be forcibly rescued from execution and kept alive. New gladiators were also trained, not by the usual professionals in the schools, but in private houses, by Roman knights and even senators who happened to be masters at arms. Letters of this survive, begging these trainers to give their pupils individual instruction in the art of fighting. He fixed the daily pay of the regular soldiers at double what it had been for all time. Whenever the granaries were full, he would make a lavish distribution to the army without measuring the amount, and occasionally gave every man a Gallic slave. To preserve Pompey's friendship and renew the family ties dissolved by Julia's death, he offered him the hand of his sister's granddaughter Octavia, though she had already married Gaius Marcellus, and in return asked leave to marry Pompey's daughter, who was betrothed to Faustus Sulla. Having now won all Pompey's friends, the most of the Senate to his side, with loans at a low rate of interest, or interest-free, he endeared himself to persons of less distinction by handing out valuable presents, whether or not they asked for them. His beneficiaries included the favorite slaves or freedom of prominent men. Caesar thus became the one reliable source of help to all who were in legal difficulties, or in debt, or living beyond their means, and refused help only to those whose criminal record was so black, or whose purse so empty, or whose tastes were so expensive that even he could do nothing for them. He frankly told such people, "What you need is a civil war." Caesar took equal pains to win the esteem of kings and provincial authorities by offering them gifts of prisoners, thousands at a time, or lending them troops whenever they asked, and without first obtaining official permission from the Senate or people. He also presented the principal cities of Asia and Greece with magnificent public works, and did the same for those of Italy, Gaul, and Spain. Everyone was amazed by this liberality and wondered what the sequel would be. At last, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the consul, announced in the house that he intended to raise a matter of vital public interest, and then proposed that since the Gallic War had now ended and peace was restored, Caesar should be relieved of his command before his term as governor-general expired, that a successor should be appointed, and that the armies in Gaul should be disbanded. He further proposed that Caesar should be forbidden to stand for the consulship without appearing at Rome in person, since a decree against irregularities of this sort still appeared on the statute book. Here Marcellus was on firm legal ground. Pompey, when he introduced a bill regulating the privileges of state officials, had omitted to make a special exception for Caesar in the clause debarring absentees from candidacy, or to correct this oversight before the bill had been passed, engraved on a bronze tablet, and registered at the public treasury. Nor was Marcellus content to oust Caesar from his command and cancel the privilege already voted him, namely to stand for the consulship in absentia. He also asked that the colonists whom Caesar had settled at Novum Comum under the Vatinian Act should lose their citizenship. This award, he said, had been intended to further Caesar's political ambitions and lacked legal sanction. The news infuriated Caesar, but he had often been reported as saying, "Now that I am the leading Roman of my day, it will be harder to put me down a peg than degrade me to the ranks." So he resisted stubbornly, persuading the tribunes of the people to veto Marcellus's bills, and at the same time enlisting the help of Servius Sulpicius, Marcellus's colleague. When, in the following year, Marcellus was succeeded in office by his cousin Gaius, who adopted a similar policy, Caesar again won over the other consul, Aemilius Paulus, with a heavy bribe, and also bought Gaius Curio, the most energetic tribune of the people. Realizing, however, that the opposition had made a determined stand and that both the new consuls-elect were unfriendly to him, he appealed to the Senate, begging them, in a written address, not to cancel a privilege voted him by the commons, without forcing all other governor-generals to resign their commands at the same time as he did. But this was read as meaning that he counted on mobilizing his veteran troops sooner than Pompey could his raw levies. Next, Caesar offered to resign command of 8 legions and quit Transalpine Gaul, if he might keep 2 legions in Cisalpine Gaul, or at least Illyricum, and 1 legion until he became consul. Since the Senate refused to intervene on his behalf, and his opponents insisted that he would accept no compromise in a matter of such national importance, Caesar crossed into Cisalpine Gaul, where he held his regular assizes, and halted at Ravenna. He was resolved to invade Italy if force were used against the tribunes of the people who had vetoed the Senate's decree disbanding his army by a given date. Force was, in effect, used, and the tribunes fled towards Cisalpine Gaul, which became Caesar's pretext for launching the civil war. Additional motives are suspected, however. Pompey's comment was that, because Caesar had insufficient capital to carry out his grandiose schemes, or give the people all that they had been encouraged to expect on his return, he chose to create an atmosphere of political confusion. Another view is that he dreaded having to account for the irregularities of his first consulship, during which he had disregarded auspices and vetoes, for Marcus Cato had often sworn to impeach him as soon as the legions were disbanded. Moreover, people said at the time, frankly enough, that should Caesar return from Gaul as a private citizen, he would be tried in a court ringed around with armed men. As Titus, Annius Milo had lately been at Pompey's orders. Footnote 52 BC. End of footnote. This sounds plausible enough because Asinius Pollio records in his history that when Caesar at the battle of Pharsalus saw his enemies forced to choose between massacre and flight, he said in these very words, "They brought it on themselves. They would have condemned me regardless of all my victories. Me, Gaius Caesar, had I not appealed to my army for help." It has also been suggested that constant exercise of power gave Caesar a love of it, and that after weighing his enemy's strength against his own, he took this chance of fulfilling his youthful dreams by making a bid for the monarchy. Cicero seems to have come to a similar conclusion in the 3rd book of his essay on duties. He records that Caesar quoted the following lines from Euripides, Phoenician Woman, on several occasions. "It's a crime consonant with nobility. Is crime consonant with nobility? Then noblest is the crime of tyranny. In all things else, obey the laws of heaven." Accordingly, when news reached him that the tribune's veto had been disallowed, and that they had fled the city, he at once sent a few cohorts ahead with all secrecy, and disarmed suspicion by himself attending a theatrical performance inspecting the plans of a school of gladiators, which he proposed to build, and dining as usual among a crowd of guests. But at dusk he borrowed a pair of mules from a bakery near headquarters, harnessed them to a gig, and set off quietly with a few of his staff. His lights went out, he lost his way, and the party wandered about aimlessly for some hours, but at dawn found a guide who led them on foot along narrow lanes until they came to the right road. Caesar overtook his advanced guard at the river Rubicon, which formed the frontier between Gaul and Italy. Well aware how critical a decision confronted him, he turned to his staff, remarking, "We may still draw back, but, once across that little bridge, we shall have to fight it out." As he stood in two minds, an apparition of superhuman size and beauty was seen sitting on the river bank, playing a reed pipe. A party of shepherds gathered around to listen, and when some of Caesar's men, including some of the trumpeters, broke ranks to do the same, the apparition snatched a trumpet from one of them, ran down to the river, blew a thunderous blast, and crossed over. Caesar exclaimed, "Let us accept this as a sign from the gods, and follow where they beckon, in vengeance on our double-dealing enemies. The die is cast." He led his army to the farther bank, where he welcomed the tribunes of the people who had fled to him from Rome. Then he tearfully addressed the troops, and ripping open his tunic to expose his breast, begged them to stand faithfully by him. The belief that he then promised to promote every man present to the equestrian order is based on a misunderstanding. He had accompanied his pleas with the gesture of pointing to his left hand, as he declared that he would gladly reward those who championed his honor with the very seal ring from his thumb. But some soldiers on the fringe of the assembly, who saw him better than they could hear his words, read too much into the gesture. They put it about that Caesar had promised them all the right to wear a knight's gold ring, and the 4,000 gold pieces required to support a knighthood. Here follows a brief account of Caesar's subsequent movements. He occupied Picenum, Umbria, and Etruria, captured Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who had been illegally named as his successor in Gaul, and was holding Corfinium for the Senate, let him go free, and then marched along the Adriatic coast to Brundusium, where Pompey and the consuls had fled from Rome on their way to Epirus. When his efforts to prevent their crossing the straits proved ineffective, he marched on Rome, entered it, summoned the Senate to review the political situation, and then hurriedly set off for Spain. Pompey's strongest forces were stationed there under the command of his friends Marcus Patrius, Lucius Afranius, and Marcus Varro. Before leaving, Caesar told his household, "I am off to meet an army without a leader. When I return, I shall meet a leader without an army." Though delayed by the siege of Massilia, which had shut its gates against him, and by a failure of his commissariat, he won a rapid and overwhelming victory. Caesar returned by way of Rome, crossed the Adriatic, and after blockading Pompey for nearly 4 months behind immense containing works, routed him at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Footnote: at Dyrrachium in Epirus. End of footnote. Pompey fled to Alexandria. Caesar followed, and when he found that king, Ptolemy the third had murdered Pompey and was planning to murder him as well, declared war. This proved to be the most difficult campaign, awkward both in time and place, fought during winter within the city walls of the well-equipped and cunning enemy. But though caught off his guard and without military supplies of any kind, Caesar was victorious. He then handed over the government of Egypt to Queen Cleopatra and her younger brother. Footnote: Ptolemy the 14th. End of footnote. Fearing that, if made a Roman province, it might one day be held against his fellow countrymen by some independent-minded governor-general. From Alexandria he proceeded to Syria, and from Syria to Pontus. News having come that Pharnaces, son of the famous Mithridates, had taken advantage of the confused situation and already gained several successes. 5 days after his arrival, and 4 hours after catching sight of Pharnaces, Caesar won a crushing victory, and commented dryly on Pompey's good fortune in having built up his reputation for generalship by victories over such poor stuff as this. Then he beat Scipio and King Juba in North Africa, where the remnants of the Pompeian party were being reorganized, and Pompey's 2 sons in Spain. Footnote: The 3 battles were at Zela, Pontus, Thapsus, North Africa, and Munda, Spain. End of footnote. Throughout the civil war, Caesar was never defeated himself, but of his generals, Gaius Curio was killed fighting in North Africa. Gaius Antonius was captured off Illyricum. Publius Dolabella lost another fleet off Illyricum, and Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus had his army destroyed in Pontus. Yet, though invariably successful, he twice came close to disaster, at Dyrrachium, where Pompey broke his blockade and forced him to retreat. Caesar remarked when Pompey failed to pursue him, "He does not know how to win wars." And in the final battle, where all seemed lost, and he even considered a suicide. Footnote: Munda. End of footnote. After defeating Scipio, Caesar celebrated 4 triumphs in 1 month, with a few days' interval between them, and after defeating the sons of Pompey, a 5th. These triumphs were the Gallic, the first and most magnificent, the Alexandrian, the Pontic, the African, and lastly the Spanish. Each differed completely from the others in its presentation. As Caesar rode through the Velabrum on the day of his Gallic triumph, the axle of his triumphal chariot broke, and he nearly took a toss, but afterwards ascended to the Capitol between 2 lines of elephants, 40 in all, which acted as his torch-bearers. In the Pontic triumph, one of the decorated wagons, instead of a stage set representing scenes from the war, like the rest, carried a simple 3-word inscription: "I came, I saw, I conquered." This referred not to the events of the war, like the other inscriptions, but to the speed with which it had been won. Every infantryman of Caesar's veteran legions earned a war gratuity of 240 gold pieces, in addition to the 20 paid at the outbreak of hostilities, and a farm. These farms could not be grouped together without evicting former owners, but were scattered all over the countryside. Every member of the commons received 10 pecks of grain and 10 pounds of oil as a bounty, besides the 3 gold pieces which Caesar had promised at first, and now raised to 4 by way of interest on the delay in payment. He added a popular banquet and a distribution of meat, also a dinner to celebrate his Spanish victory, but decided that this had not been splendid enough, and 5 days later served a second, more succulent one. His public shows were a great variety. They included a gladiatorial contest, stage plays for every Roman ward performed in several languages, chariot races in the circus, athletic competitions, and a mock naval battle. At the gladiatorial contest in the Forum, a man named Furius Leptinus of Praetorian family fought Quintus Calpinus, a barrister and former senator, to the death. The sons of leaders of Asia and Bithynia danced the Pyrrhic sword dance. One of the plays was written and acted by Decimus Liberius, a Roman knight. After the performance, he was given 5,000 gold pieces and had his gold ring, the badge of equestrian rank, restored to him, so that he could walk straight from stage to orchestra, where 14 rows of seats were reserved for his order. A broad ditch had been dug around the race course, now extended at either end of the circus, and the contestants were young noblemen who drove 4-horse and 2-horse chariots, or rode pairs of horses, jumping from back to back. The so-called Troy game, a sham fight supposedly introduced by Annius, was performed by 2 troops of boys, one younger than the other. Wild beast hunts took place 5 days running, and the entertainment ended with a battle between 2 armies, each consisting of 500 infantry, 20 elephants, and 30 cavalry. To let the camps be pitched facing each other, Caesar removed the central barrier of the circus around which the chariots ran. Athletic contests were held in a temporary stadium on the Campus Martius and lasted for 3 days. The naval battle was fought on an artificial lake dug in the Lesser Codetta between Tyrian and Egyptian ships, with 2, 3, or 4 banks of oars, and heavily manned. Such huge numbers of visitors flocked to these shows from all directions that many of them had to sleep in tents pitched along the streets or roads or on rooftops, and often the pressure of the crowd crushed people to death. The victims included 2 senators. Caesar next turned his attention to domestic reforms. First, he reorganized the calendar, which the College of Priests had allowed to fall into such disorder by inserting days or months as it suited them, that the harvest and the vintage festivals no longer corresponded with the appropriate seasons. He linked the year to the course of the sun by lengthening it to 365 days. Footnote. The year had previously consisted of 355 days. End of footnote. Abolishing the short extra month and adding an entire day every 4th year. But to make the next 1st of January fall on the right season, he drew out this particular year by 2 months, 2 extra months inserted between November and December, so that it consisted of 15, including the intercalary one inserted after February in the old style. And there's a footnote on the particular year, 46 BC, and a footnote. He brought the Senate up to strength by creating new patricians and increased the yearly quota of praetors, aediles, and quaestors, as well as the minor officials, reinstating those degraded by the censors or condemned for corruption by a jury. Also, he arranged with the commons that apart from the consul, half of the magistrates should be popularly elected and half nominated by himself. Allowing even the sons of proscribed men to stand, he circulated brief directions to the voters. For instance, Caesar, the dictator, to such and such a tribe of voters, I recommend so and so to you for office. He limited jury service to knights and senators, disqualifying the treasury tribunes. Footnote. The property grade next below the knights. End of footnote. Caesar changed the old method of registering voters. He made the city landlords help him to complete the list, street by street, and reduced from 320,000 to 150,000 the number of householders who might draw free grain. To do away with the nuisance of having to summon everyone for enrollment periodically, he made the praetors keep the registers up to date by replacing the names of dead men with those of others not yet listed. Since the population of Rome had been considerably diminished by the transfer of 80,000 men to overseas colonies, he forbade any citizen between the ages of 20 and 40 who was not serving in the army to absent himself from Italy for more than 3 years in succession. Nor might any senator's son travel abroad unless as a member of some magistrate's household or staff, and at least a third of the cattlemen employed by graziers had to be free-born. Caesar also granted the citizenship to all medical practitioners and professors of liberal arts, residents in Rome, thus inducing them to remain and tempting others to follow suit. He disappointed popular agitators by cancelling no debts, but in the end decreed that every debtor should have his property assessed according to pre-war valuation, and, after deducting the interest already paid, directly or by way of a banker's guarantee, should satisfy his creditors with whatever sum that might represent. This left debtors with perhaps a fourth party of their property. Caesar dissolved all workers' guilds except the ancient ones, and increased the penalties for crime. And since wealthy men had less compunction about committing major offenses, because the worst that could happen to them was a sentence of exile, he punished murderers of fellow citizens. As Cicero records, by the seizure of either their entire property or half of it. In his administration of justice, he was both conscientious and severe, and went so far as to degrade senators found guilty of extortion. Once, when an ex-praetor married a woman on the day after her divorce from another man, he annulled the union, although adultery between them was not suspected. He imposed a tariff on foreign manufacturers, forbade the use, except on stated occasions, of litters, and the wearing of either scarlet robes or pearls by those below a certain rank and age. To implement his laws against luxury, he placed inspectors in different parts of the market to seize delicacies offered for sale in violation of his orders. Sometimes he even sent lictors and guards into the dining rooms to remove illegal dishes already served, which his watchmen had failed to intercept. Caesar continually undertook great new works for the embellishment of the city, or for the empire's protection and enlargement. His first projects were a temple of Mars, the biggest in the world, to build which he would have had to fill up and pave the lake where the naval sham fight had been staged, and an enormous theater sloping down from the Tarpeian rock on the Capitoline Hill. Another task he set himself was the reduction of the civil code to manageable proportions, by selecting from the unwieldy mass of statutes only the most essential and publishing them in a few volumes. Still another was to provide the finest possible public libraries, by commissioning Marcus Varro to collect and classify Greek and Latin books. His engineering schemes included the draining of the Pomptine marshes and of Lake Fucinus, also a highway running from the Adriatic across to the Apennines to the Tiber, and a canal to be cut through the Isthmus of Corinth. In the military field, he planned an expulsion of the Dacians from the Black Sea area and Thrace, which they had recently occupied, and then an attack on Parthia by way of Lesser Armenia. but decided not to risk a pitched battle until he had familiarized himself with Parthian tactics. All these schemes were cancelled by his assassination. Before describing that, I should perhaps give a brief description of his appearance, personal habits, dress, character, and conduct in peace and war. Caesar is said to have been tall, fair, and well-built, with a rather broad face and keen dark brown eyes. His health was sound, apart from sudden comas and a tendency to nightmares which troubled him towards the end of his life. But he twice had epileptic fits while on campaign. He was something of a dandy, always keeping his head carefully trimmed and shaved, and has been accused of having certain other hairy parts of his body depilated with tweezers. His baldness was a disfigurement which his enemies harped upon, much to his exasperation, but he used to comb the thin strands of hair forward from his poll. And of all the honors voted him by the Senate and people, none pleased him so much as the privilege of wearing a laurel wreath on all occasions. He constantly took advantage of it. His dress was, it seems, unusual. He had added wrist-length sleeves with fringes to his purple-striped senatorial tunic, and the belt which he wore over it was never tightly fastened. Hence Sulla's warning to the aristocratic party, "Beware of that boy with the loose clothes." Caesar's first home was a modest house in the Subura quarter, but later, as chief pontiff, he used the official residence on the Sacred Way. Contemporary literature contains frequent references to his fondness for luxurious living, having built a country mansion at Nemus from the foundations up. One story goes, he found certain features in it to dislike, so that, although poor at the time and heavily in debt, he tore the whole place down. It is also recorded that he carried tessellated and mosaic pavements with him on his campaigns. Pearls seem to have been the lure that prompted his invasion of Britain. He would sometimes weigh them in the palm of his hand to judge their value, and was also a keen collector of gems, carvings, statues, and old masters. So high were the prices he paid for slaves of good appearance and attainments that he became ashamed of his extravagance and would not allow the sums to be entered in his accounts. I find also that while stationed abroad he also had dinner served in 2 separate rooms, one for his officers and Greek friends, the other for Roman citizens and the more important provincials. He paid such strict attention to his domestic economy, however small the detail, that he once put his baker in irons for giving him a different sort of bread from that served to his guest, and executed a favorite freedman for committing adultery with a knight's wife, although no complaint had been lodged by the husband.